They say that variety is the spice of life, and it definitely is something about anime that I love. One second you could be watching a manliness extravaganza that is a show like Gurren Lagann, and the next you move on to a show about a fox girl that happens to teach you about medieval economics. And that is just completely awesome. There's something there for casual watchers, and there's also something there for the people who consider themselves to be more of the intellectual crowd. However, the problem with creating a show for the intellectual crowd is that you can't half-ass it. Otherwise, they either get bored and then just walk away, or get really pissed off. You have to do it right. The show has to be smart, but it also has to be entertaining, to have that energy. You know, that heart to it that makes people want to watch it regardless of its sophisticated themes. Today we are looking at an anime from the director-screenwriter tag team that brought us one of my favorite anime, Spice and Wolf. Ladies, gentlemen, and others, my name is Arcada, and welcome to Glass Reflection. Today, Maoyu Mao Yusha, which is a tongue twister, and I'll probably screw up saying that later on in this video. Anyway, that's today. Let's jam. You may have gathered from the opening segment that Maoyu Mao Yusha falls under the category of a more intellectual show than the norm. And while its themes are certainly more involved than most, the overall plot is rather straightforward. It takes place in a stereotypical medieval-style fantasy universe where two dimensions are in a state of almost constant war. One dimension is populated by your typical humans, who also in some cases have magical powers, you know, like you do in a fantasy setting. And the other dimension is populated by hundreds of different species of demons. The humans, in their infinite and, again, fantasy stereotyped wisdom, gather a group of heroic warriors to fight to the center of the demon realm and defeat the Demon King, which presumably would then result in peace throughout the land. At least for the humans, anyway. Thing is, the Demon King is not your traditional Demon King.
Konnichiwa, Yusha.
何者だお前は
魔王だ。
魔王ふざけるな何者なんだ
だから魔王だ。
なんで魔王が女なんだよ
伝統的な称号なのだからしょうがない。
Instead of ending the war through battles and bloodshed, the current Demon King wishes to end the war through peaceful negotiations. But being rather wise, she realizes that the mindsets about the war on both sides would have to change before peace could be reached. To simply declare peace would not solve anything, as you have the noble families and influential merchants on both sides that are making their entire fortunes on the war and would like nothing else for the war to continue until the end of time, if possible. So she decides to team up with the human hero to try and create a more peaceful world. And as a premise, it works out rather well. It's unfortunately in the execution that it falls flat at times. I'd like to say that the problem with the show is that it is too short, but that doesn't seem to be the main issue here. The use of time skips is one of my biggest problems, as between any two episodes, it could be a time span of a month or even close to a year that just happens to, happen. And the use of time skips like that make it really hard to get invested in the story. But it's also hard to see the significance of some things, as you don't get to actually witness the ramifications of what happens in between those episodes. So you can't really appreciate any of it, and overall the plot kind of suffers heavily because of it. Now, there are a multitude of character developments and side plots that are really well done, with many moving moments of the show, but because of it, the main plot tends to get sidelined, and I don't think that is something that should have happened. Top that off with the fact that there is no resolution for the main plot at the end of the show, and what you have is a formula for wasted potential. It's enjoyable to witness, to be sure, but the improvements could have been there, and that's what I find frustrating. Oh yeah, and there's also this romance subplot that kinda goes nowhere. So there's that. The characters were a little better off than the story, which goes a long way, but there are still some explanations that were never given, and that, kind of bugs me. The Demon King herself throughout the series ends up quote-unquote inventing various different technologies to help their little test community out in the mountains to prosper, and then has those inventions spread throughout the kingdom, but they never never really explain where she came up with all of it in the first place. Like, I would have thought, had the demons been so much more advanced than the humans, that the war would not have been at such a stalemate. But I suppose it's one of those things to ignore because the plot demands it. I rather like the Demon King herself, though. She's rather strong-willed and has the smarts to accomplish her goals while having the patience required to carry those goals out. Really, the only thing I dislike about her is the rather obvious.
She's got huge tracts of land.
But I figure you have to have something to keep a particular kind of audience interested. It worked with Spice and Wolf and that whole naked female wolf thing. This time it's a lot more basic, even if a bit more extreme. The hero is actually rather boring. He's basically just a male counterpart to the Demon King, and his personality is rather simple. The difference between him and the Demon King is that she's the one coming up with all the plans, and he just acts on them. The few times that he does make plans on his own, they're either so small they don't really affect anything, or they just go completely out of his control. But everything usually works out in the end because he's a max level epic warrior who can level a volcano by accident, so it's all good. The side characters come in one of two flavors. There is the ones who get a decent amount of screen time, and the ones who do not. For those who get a decent amount, like the maids, the paladin, and a few of the merchants that had developments, this turned out quite nicely. As for everyone else, well, they were just kinda there. Like the high-level female mage that seemed to be suffering from multiple personality disorder, complete with body morphing powers. Never did figure out what her deal was. And, well, things like that come with the territory of a 13-episode series, folks. It happens. As with most shows that do not involve heavy amounts of action scenes, the animation is able to stay at a rather constant level. Not that this constant level is amazing by any stretch of the imagination. It's a bit more average looking than I would have liked. On top of that, with the money they saved on the animation budget, they made up for it with the very nicely detailed backgrounds that have a rather beautiful painted look to them. It just added to the fantasy feel, which I rather like. The only real downside is if you happen to get easily annoyed by bouncing boobs. But hey, it's an ARMS anime, the studio famous for shows like Ikitosen and Queen's Blade. So, all things considered, Maoyu is rather tame by comparison. It's also not as violent as another ARMS anime, Elfen Lied, and some might consider that a disappointment, but considering the subject matter, it's a rather nice plus, actually. Similar to other anime with the same basic setting, Maoyu opted to go to the more traditional folk feel with its music. You know, which is a surefire way to get it added to a list of soundtracks that I just happen to listen to over and over and over and over. Seriously though, it's just a particular set of instruments that they use, which I love. And the extra orchestrations and the vocal choir that the soundtrack likes to use at times just throws it over the top for me. The opening, I will admit, is nothing too fancy, but it does become something that will get stuck in your head for a bit. There are parts of the design of it I dislike, like I hate those flowers on that tunic. I realize it's from the show itself, but it just looks off and bugs me. Maoyu is a show that seems to be trying to capitalize on multiple things. Firstly, with the popularity and fanbase of the Spice and Wolf series, and also to a lesser extent, perhaps the fanbase of the Eurogame Monster Girl quest. I say lesser extent because Maoyu doesn't have any sex and they don't solve their problems by beating the shit out of each other. The general premises between the two are too similar to ignore, even if the similarities go out the window as soon as episode 1 of Maoyu ends. What Maoyu really needed, though, was more time. The overall plot was way too rushed for you to properly invest time into it, even if the side plots and the character developments did a lot to make up for that, which they did. As usual, though, the ending is paramount, and in this regard, the show fails as the main plot remains unfinished. It was a nice weekend spent watching this show, to be sure, and what we got was still not half bad, but it could have been so much better. That's my main problem with it. And so, with all that in mind, I've meticulously calculated values for the category of story, characters, animation, sound, and my own personal enjoyment, which, after convincing it to be my ally while we go out and do some really interesting, albeit a little boring economic stuff, has me awarding Maoyu Mao Yusha with an overall score of 7.52 out of 10, and a recommendation to stream it rather than buy. It has its moments, but its lack of a conclusive story stops it from being truly memorable in my eyes. Others may see it differently, but that's what I see. At the time of this video, Maoyu is unlicensed in North America, however, is available for streaming over on Crunchyroll in its entirety for free if you happen to use that site. For alternate anime recommendations, I point you towards the other economic-heavy show, Spice and Wolf, even though I have my issues with it, specifically with the lack of a third season following that ending of the second season. It's still a memorable recommendation though. Also recommended is Kino's Journey, and while it may not be remarkably similar to Maoyu in almost any respect, they both share the same kind of calmness to their setting for the majority of the show. Between those two, you should find something to your liking. And that's it for me. If you haven't already, please subscribe for more videos, follow me on Twitter if you feel so inclined, and until next time, ladies, gentlemen, and others, stay frosty.